Warner Brothers had one rule for Christopher Nolan before they gave him Batman, but as it turns out, he was perfectly fine with it. Batman Begins turns 20 years old this week, so here's some things I bet you never knew about it. The story behind Batman starts in New York City in 1939. After DC, then known as Detective Comics, found success with Superman, its editors demanded more superheroes. And so Bob Kane and Bill Finger created Batman, a master detective with a brooding personality driven by the murder of his parents, who dressed up with the silhouette of a bat. Batman would of course become one of the most iconic fictional characters of the 20th century, appearing in more than 8,400 comic book issues and dozens of TV shows and movies. Batman first came to the screen in a 1943 serial film series starring Lewis Wilson, and was later brought to life on television and in the movies in the 1960s by Adam West. The Adam West Batman was produced by Greenway Productions and 20th Century Fox. But in 1969, the parent company that owned Warner Brothers acquired the parent company that owned DC Comics, and so the DC characters from then on became part of the WB family. In 1989, Warner Brothers and Tim Burton adapted Batman for the modern blockbuster age. That $411 million hit spawned the sequels Batman Returns and Batman Forever. Then in 1996, Warner Brothers goes into production on a fourth Batman movie, Batman and Robin. It liked what it was seeing from director Joel Schumacher, so it told them to start developing a fifth Batman movie, titled Batman Unchained, which would have included Scarecrow and Harley Quinn. But then Batman and Robin hit theaters in 1997 and was a disaster, so Warner Brothers abandoned the follow-up project. In the late 90s and early 2000s, the studio developed and nearly went into production on a number of live-action Batman movies. There was a Batman vs. Superman movie from director Wolfgang Peterson, Darren Aronofsky was hired for a Batman Beyond movie, and then later a Batman Year One adaptation. Joaquin Phoenix, Freddie Prinze Jr., and Christian Bale's names were all in the mix on those doomed projects, but none of them ended up happening. So it was now 2003, and Warner Brothers needed to keep the franchise going. So, one, it decided to make Catwoman starring Halle Berry. We all know how that turned out. And two, it hired Memento director Christopher Nolan and Blade writer David S. Goyer to take their stab at a mainline Batman film. Nolan wanted to go back to the beginning. As he told Variety in 2004, his goal was, quote, to do the origin story of the character, which is a story that's never been told before. And by that, I think he means it's never been told in full detail on the big screen. Nolan was committed to making it grounded and realistic. Quote, the world of Batman is that of grounded reality. It will be a recognizable, contemporary reality against which an extraordinary heroic figure arises. Nolan was heavily influenced by the relatable human drama of Richard Donner's Superman, and intentionally wanted to hire big-name actors to give it an epic feel and credibility. Warner Brothers had just one stipulation for Nolan. The movie had to be PG-13, which was fine by the director because, quote, my view was that this is a movie I wanted to see when I was 11 years old. So in my mind, it's always been PG-13. And this is why the movie isn't especially gory or bloody. Nolan's jumping off point was the 1989 comic book story The Man Who Falls, that focused on Bruce Wayne's travels across the world as a young man. The scene of a young Bruce falling into a well was adapted from that comic. The Long Halloween also inspired David S. Goyer and led to them using Carmine Falcone. They considered having Harvey Dent in the movie, but ultimately replaced him with this new character, Rachel Dawes, because they felt they couldn't do Harvey justice in this film. They borrowed Bruce's absence from Gotham for Batman Year One as setup for their screenplay. And Jim Gordon's character in the film was also heavily influenced by Year One. They chose the Scarecrow and Ra's al Ghul as the villains because they had never been depicted in live action before. In other Batman stories, Bruce Wayne sees a Zorro film when he's young, which inspires his vigilantism. Christopher Nolan ignored this idea because he wanted Bruce to come up with being a hero on his own. And for that reason, Nolan believes other DC superheroes do not exist in this universe. The most famous casting story from Batman Begins is that Josh Hartnett met with Chris Nolan for the role of Batman, but ultimately decided not to pursue it. Christian Bale, meanwhile, beat out Aeon Bailey, Henry Cavill, Billy Crudup, Hugh Dancy, Jake Gyllenhaal, Joshua Jackson, David Boreanaz, Heath Ledger, and Cillian Murphy for the role. The final three were Bale, Bailey, and Murphy. They wore Val Kilmer's batsuit for the audition and read with Amy Adams, who stepped in as a reader as a favor to the casting director. So Christian Bale gets the part, and he had just lost a bunch of weight for The Machinist, so he hired a personal trainer and put on 100 pounds of muscle in just a few months for the film. He ended up actually overshooting that goal by about 30 pounds and had to lose that weight quickly. Nolan first offered the role of Alfred to Anthony Hopkins, who turned it down. So then he personally visited Michael Caine at home to deliver the script and the offer. Gary Oldman was Nolan's first choice for Henry Ducard, aka Ra's al Ghul. But when Chris Cooper turned down the part of Jim Gordon, Nolan made Oldman Gordon instead. Chris Nolan then discussed Henry with Guy Pearce, who starred in Memento, but they realized he'd be too young. Viggo Mortensen was considered for the role at one point before Liam Neeson got the part. Nolan cast Katie Holmes in the movie thanks to her, quote, tremendous warmth and great emotional appeal. Robert Downey Jr. was considered for the Scarecrow before Nolan gave it to Cillian Murphy. Jack Gleason, who'd later played Joffrey in Game of Thrones, has a small part in the film, and he was personally recommended by Christian Bale after they worked together on Reign of Fire. For the film's design, Nolan was heavily influenced by Blade Runner. Production designer Nathan Crowley built a model of Gotham City in Nolan's garage and drew inspiration from New York, Chicago, and Tokyo. The Narrows were inspired by the now demolished walled city of Kowloon in Hong Kong. The Tumbler was created from scratch. They designed and built 4 completely real, street-ready models of the Batmobile, costing $250,000 each. One of the 4 had an actual jet engine mounted to it, fueled by 6 propane tanks. Visibility inside the vehicles was pretty bad, so it had cameras on the outside and video monitors on the inside so the stunt drivers could see where they were going. The drivers practiced driving the cars for 6 months before driving them on the streets of Chicago during production. The interior of the Tumbler was then a stagnant set on a soundstage, and they also used a remote-controlled miniature for some of the shots. But when the Tumbler goes through the waterfall, that was real. Nolan made sure that his Batsuit was more flexible and mobile than previous incarnations. Likewise, the cowl was made to be thin enough to allow motion, but thick enough not to wrinkle. The British Ministry of Defense helped costume designer Lindy Hemming create a cape that was made from parachute nylon that had electrostatic flocking. Fight choreographers Justo Dieguez and Andy Norman trained the actors and stunt performers in the Spanish Kizi fighting method, a self-defense system whose training is based on the study and cultivation of natural instincts. Warner Brothers set the budget at $150 million, and filming began on Batman Begins in March 2004. A glacier in Iceland stood in for Bhutan, where the crew built a village and the facade of Ra's al Ghul's temple. Weather was a big challenge in Iceland as they fought rain and 75-mile-per-hour winds. Nolan shot Gotham City exteriors in London, New York, and Chicago to make it feel like a real city. Bentmore Towers in England served as a location for Wayne Manor. The National Institute for Medical Research building in Mill Hill was Arkham Asylum's exterior, while the St. Pancras railway station and Abbey Mills pumping stations were used for its interiors. They shot courtroom scenes at the Senate House of University College London. In Chicago, they convinced the city to raise the Franklin Street Bridge for one shot. But the majority of the film was shot on sound stages at Shepperton Studios in the UK, where they built the Batcave set, measuring 250 feet long, 120 feet wide, and 40 feet high. And it featured a real 14,000-gallon waterfall built with 12 water pumps. And they also turned an airship hangar in Bedfordshire into a soundstage, which was where they built the Narrows and part of the monorail. They also built scale models for the Narrows and Ra's al Ghul's temple. Production wrapped in September of 2004. During post-production, CGI was used to create establishing shots of Gotham, Wayne Tower, and the monorail. The third act monorail sequence was a mix of live-action footage, model work, and CGI. The flocks of bats seen in the film were also entirely CGI. For the music, Nolan first approached Hans Zimmer, but Zimmer asked if he could also bring on James Newton Howard, and the 2 composers worked separately to create individual themes for Bruce and Batman. Zimmer didn't want this score to sound like any previous Batman movie, so he used a combination of orchestra and electronic music. In early 2005, some industry insiders worried that Batman Begins might underperform at the box office because Christian Bale wasn't a big enough star, it didn't have recognizable villains, the last Batman movie was a disaster, and Katie Holmes was attached to Tom Cruise, who had just jumped on Oprah's couch. Batman Begins opened on 3,858 screens in the US on June 15th, 2005, and it brought in $48.7 million opening weekend, which was fine. It would go on to gross $373 million total worldwide, more than doubling its budget, which means that it turned a modest profit. It would then bring in an additional $167 million on DVD in its first year. Critics really like this new Batman. Today, 85% of the 287 reviews assessed by Rotten Tomatoes are positive. Audiences gave it an A CinemaScore in theater exit polls. It was nominated for dozens of awards, including 1 Oscar, Best Cinematography, which it lost to Memoirs of a Geisha. Christian Bale won an MTV Movie Award for Best Hero, while Katie Holmes was nominated for a Razzie. The movie, of course, spawned the sequels The Dark Knight and The Dark Knight Rises, which directly led to the gritty and dark tone of the DC Extended Universe. But Batman Begins was also massively influential on the culture in a lot of other ways. Basically, any genre film that was dark and gritty that came after Batman Begins is in its debt. The movie also popularized the idea of the reboot, where big screen franchises could start over from the beginning. And it gave a lot of credibility to the superhero genre in general. In 2012, Kevin Feige told Wired, Chris Nolan's Batman is the greatest thing that happened to superhero films because it bolstered everything. From Jon Favreau to Hugh Jackman to Patty Jenkins to Sam Mendes, all of these writers, actors, and directors listed below later cited Batman Begins as influential on their work. And if you've made it to the end of this video, drop a bat emoji in the comments. Also, if you want more deep dives in pop culture news, subscribe to my newsletter.